The year was 1819. The United States stood at a crossroads, young, hopeful, and seemingly stable. 11 states stood against 11. Half supported slavery, the other half opposed. From a distance, it appeared that balance had been achieved, a perfect symmetry of ideals, governance, and geography. But under the surface, this harmony was more illusion than truth, fragile and fleeting. Beneath the political surface brewed a storm of ambition and ideology. While the Constitution had delicately sidestepped the moral minefield of slavery, expansion westward, driven by dreams of manifest destiny, threatened to upset this precarious balance. Americans were spreading like wildfire, eager to claim the fertile lands of the frontier. With every new settlement came an urgent question. Would this new territory permit slavery? The Missouri Territory, part of the vast Louisiana Purchase, became the flashpoint. By 1818, Missouri was rapidly growing, ready to transition from territory to state. But its population largely supported slavery, and that desire ignited fierce debate in Congress. Admitting Missouri as a slave state would tilt the balance of power, giving the South more influence in federal affairs, something the North could not tolerate. Northern politicians, many of whom had begun to align with abolitionist thought, feared the spread of the institution. They argued that slavery was a moral abomination, incompatible with the ideals upon which the United States had been founded. For them, expansion meant danger, not only for the enslaved but for the very soul of the nation. Their Southern counterparts, however, defended slavery as integral to their economy and culture, insisting that new states should decide for themselves. The debates were bitter and unrelenting. Into this boiling pot stepped Henry Clay, a skilled orator and the Speaker of the House, who sought compromise. If Missouri were to join as a slave state, then Maine, which had long wanted to separate from Massachusetts, would be admitted as a free state. The balance, numerical at least, could be preserved. But this proposal was only a temporary salve. The underlying wounds were deep. To ensure that future territorial disputes wouldn't spiral into chaos, Congress added a geographic provision. No slavery would be allowed in territories north of the 36 degrees 30 minutes latitude line, excluding Missouri itself. This became known as the Missouri Compromise. The compromise calmed the halls of Congress, but it did not ease the hearts of Americans. The North viewed it as a necessary evil. The South saw it as an ominous precedent, a creeping federal intrusion into their regional autonomy. While both sides accepted the deal, neither trusted the other. It was, in truth, a ceasefire disguised as unity. What neither side could foresee was how this moment, quiet, procedural, legalistic, would mark the beginning of a long, tragic descent. The Missouri Compromise drew not just a line across a map, but across the American psyche. It institutionalized division. It made geography a proxy for morality. It planted seeds of resentment that would grow deep roots. As Missouri prepared to join the Union, the cultural divide between North and South deepened. The Southern economy, built on cotton and tobacco, was inextricably tied to slave labor. Wealthy plantation owners saw slavery not only as an economic necessity but as their right protected, they believed, by the Constitution. Meanwhile, in the North, the winds of industrialization had begun to blow. Factories, railroads, and wage labor defined a different kind of growth, one that did not rely on human bondage. With more immigrants arriving from Europe, especially from countries that had already abolished slavery, northern cities grew into bustling hubs of labor, reform, and change. These divergent paths fueled contrasting worldviews. To the northern mind, the South seemed stuck in an archaic system, resistant to moral progress. To the Southern elite, the North appeared arrogant, condescending, and dangerously radical. Each side feared the other's encroachment. In this atmosphere, even compromise seemed like a betrayal. The Missouri Compromise, though celebrated by some, was loathed by many. Radical abolitionists considered it an endorsement of evil. Southern firebrands considered it a humiliating restriction. Moderates hoped it would keep the peace, but even they sensed that it merely delayed an inevitable reckoning. Still, for a time, the compromise worked. Missouri entered as a slave state, Maine as a free one. The balance held. But this balance rested on a fault line that only needed one strong tremor to erupt. As new territories beckoned, Texas, California, Kansas, the same debate would return, fiercer each time, until compromise became impossible. What the Missouri Compromise truly revealed was the inherent contradiction of the American experiment. A nation founded on liberty and equality was also a nation built on the backs of the enslaved. This contradiction could be managed but not resolved by law alone. In schools and churches, in newspapers and taverns, Americans debated what their nation truly stood for. Could a land of freedom coexist with chains? Could a union be maintained if its parts were morally at odds? These questions began to haunt the public conscience, especially as the country pushed ever westward. And thus, as the 1820s dawned, America stood divided in spirit though united in name. The compromise had bought time, not peace. The line had been drawn, both literally and figuratively, and every step west would now carry the echo of that decision. In hindsight, Missouri was not just a state joining the Union. It was a symbol, a mirror, turning point. It marked the moment when Americans stopped asking whether slavery was sustainable and began asking whether the nation itself could survive its contradictions. In the decades to come, that question would be answered not with ink and parchment, but with bayonets, blood, and fire. As the embers of the Missouri Compromise still smoldered, a new fire began to burn in the American spirit, manifest destiny. This was more than political rhetoric. It was a belief, almost religious in its fervor, that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic to the Pacific. To believers, it was divine providence. To skeptics, it was imperial ambition cloaked in patriotism. Nowhere did this vision take clearer shape than in the Republic of Texas. Having wrested its independence from Mexico in 1836, Texas stood as a fledgling nation, eager to be embraced by the United States. Its people, largely Anglo-American settlers, clamored for annexation, and with them came a question that would echo through Congress. Would Texas join as a slave state? Southern leaders saw opportunity. Texas, with its vast cotton-rich lands and already thriving slave population, was a natural ally to the South. Its annexation could shift the balance of power decisively in their favor. The North, however, saw a looming threat, one that could lead to a domino effect of pro-slavery states rising in the Southwest. For nearly a decade, Texas remained in limbo. Presidents hesitated. Northerners protested. Southerners schemed. But with the election of James K. Polk in 1844, a zealous believer in manifest destiny, the tide turned. Polk's platform was clear: expand the Union whatever the cost. On December 29, 1845, Texas was admitted as the 28th state of the Union, a slave state. The ink had barely dried before tensions with Mexico flared. The Mexican government, still reeling from Texas revolt, never recognized its independence. Now, the U.S. claimed disputed lands between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. To Mexico, it was an invasion. But Polk was not merely reacting, he was maneuvering. When diplomatic overtures failed, he sent troops to the Rio Grande under General Zachary Taylor, hoping to provoke a skirmish. It worked. Shots were fired, and Polk declared that American blood has been shed on American soil. War was inevitable. Congress voted in favor, and the Mexican-American War began in 1846. While Americans were told it was a war for security and national honor, many, especially in the North, saw it differently. Abolitionists accused Polk of orchestrating the war to expand slavery. Prominent figures like Henry David Thoreau and Abraham Lincoln voiced opposition. In the North, suspicion grew. Was the war truly about territory, or about extending human bondage? On the battlefield, young officers who would later clash in the Civil War made their names. Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, and Jefferson Davis all gained their first taste of combat. The war became a proving ground, sharpening blades for the far bloodier conflict to come. The American advance was swift and ruthless. Battles from Monterrey to Buena Vista saw Mexican forces overwhelmed. By September 1847, U.S. troops occupied Mexico City. The once proud capital lay in foreign hands, and Mexico had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in 1848, sealed the terms. The treaty gave the United States a vast swath of land, what is now California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, and parts of Colorado and Wyoming. The cost was $15 million. But the real price was political. This acquisition reopened the Pandora's box of slavery. Would these new territories allow it? The North demanded that slavery be banned in the new lands. Southern leaders fumed, insisting they had fought and bled for their rightful expansion. The Wilmot Proviso, a proposal to outlaw slavery in any territory gained from Mexico, ignited a furious debate in Congress. Though it failed to pass, it marked a line in the sand. The South's paranoia deepened. To them, the North sought not just to contain slavery, but to destroy it altogether. The political tension thickened. Moderates began to vanish. Extremes took root. The Union, it seemed, had expanded too quickly, outpacing its ability to hold itself together. As California's gold rush brought settlers westward, the demographic explosion raised the stakes. California petitioned for statehood, this time as a free state. Once again, the balance of power was threatened. Would compromise be possible again? Or had the Union crossed a point of no return? Meanwhile, in Washington, Henry Clay returned with another grand proposal, what would become the Compromise of 1850. But the deeper truth lingered. America's westward expansion had not united it. It had fractured it further. The nation was a patchwork quilt of competing economies, moral codes, and visions for the future. Manifest Destiny, once seen as a glorious national mission, now appeared as a double-edged sword. It had enriched the Union but also inflamed its deepest contradictions. The land gained in victory would become the battlegrounds of moral and military struggle. In churches, town halls, and newspaper columns, the nation wrestled with its conscience. Could freedom coexist with slavery? Could unity survive ambition? Was destiny divine, or self-destruction in disguise? For many Americans, these questions became more than political abstractions, they were personal. Families split along sectional lines. Soldiers returned from war to find their homes more divided than before. The seeds planted in Missouri had now grown into tangled vines, wrapping around every branch of government. The Mexican-American War may have ended in 1848, but its true consequences were only beginning to unfold. It had widened the physical scope of the United States, but more fatally, it had deepened its ideological chasm. And as the stars on the flag multiplied, so too did the fault lines beneath them, cracking the foundation of a fragile union that no longer knew what it truly stood for. The year was 1850. The dust from the Mexican-American War had barely settled when the United States found itself ensnared in yet another crisis, one that would shake the halls of Congress and test the limits of national unity. As California's booming population demanded statehood, the question of slavery again threatened to ignite the nation's fabric from within. California had no appetite for slavery. Gold had drawn free men, fortune seekers, and adventurers, not slaveholders. But admitting California as a free state would shatter the balance carefully maintained since the Missouri Compromise. The South, already paranoid and cornered by rising abolitionist voices, saw California's free state status as a direct assault on their influence. To the Southern planter elite, the stakes were existential. Their way of life, based on slave labor, depended on political parity in the Senate. Without it, they feared the North would legislate slavery out of existence. To the North, the South's demand to expand slavery into new territories was morally intolerable. Both sides saw compromise as a betrayal. Yet, without one, the Union risked unraveling. Into this maelstrom stepped Henry Clay, the 73-year-old statesman known as the Great Compromiser. He had brokered uneasy truces before, but this time the divisions ran deeper than ever. Flanked by aging titans like Daniel Webster and John C. Calhoun, Clay proposed an ambitious package of bills to address the crisis holistically, what would later be known collectively as the Compromise of 1850. Clay's plan sought to placate both factions. California would be admitted as a free state. The territories of New Mexico and Utah would be allowed to decide the issue of slavery for themselves through popular sovereignty. Meanwhile, to appease Southern fears, Congress would enact a new, far stricter Fugitive Slave Act, requiring northern states to return escaped slaves and criminalize those who helped them flee. Also included was the settlement of the Texas boundary dispute and the federal assumption of Texas debt, an olive branch to the South. And to further mollify abolitionist sensibilities, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be abolished in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. Despite Clay's impassioned efforts, Congress was paralyzed. The omnibus bill was too broad, too ambitious, and too controversial. It failed to pass as a single package. But under the strategic guidance of Senator Stephen A. Douglass, the compromise was repackaged into separate bills and passed individually. Piece by piece, the shattered mirror was glued back together. For the moment, civil war was averted. Leaders across the nation breathed a sigh of relief. The newspapers praised the compromise as a triumph of moderation. But that relief would prove tragically short-lived. The Compromise of 1850 was not a solution, it was a stalling tactic, a bandage on a wound that needed surgery. Most incendiary among the measures was the new Fugitive Slave Act. It transformed the federal government into an active enforcer of slavery. Runaways could now be seized in the North without trial or testimony. Judges received financial incentives to rule in favor of slaveholders. Free black Americans were kidnapped and sold south with no recourse. Northern outrage was immediate and widespread. Cities like Boston and Philadelphia erupted in protest. Vigilance committees formed to protect fugitives. The Underground Railroad intensified its efforts. Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, and other abolitionist leaders risked everything to defy the law. Resistance was no longer symbolic, it was direct. To Southerners, Northern defiance only proved their worst fears. If the North would not honor the law, what recourse did the South have? Their belief in the Union weakened. States' rights rhetoric grew sharper, and whispers of secession became more frequent in Southern legislatures. Meanwhile, the doctrine of popular sovereignty, meant to soothe sectional tensions, soon became a poison chalice. By allowing territories to decide the fate of slavery themselves, it guaranteed future confrontations. Where Congress had once drawn lines, it now passed the responsibility and the consequences onto settlers. The compromise had also exposed the limitations of the political generation that had long held the Union together. Clay, Calhoun, and Webster would all be dead within 2 years. A new generation, less willing to compromise and more radical in their convictions, would take the reins in a country growing more polarized by the day. Even President Millard Fillmore, who signed the bills into law, understood the temporary nature of what had been accomplished. The legislation did not heal the wounds of the Republic. It merely concealed them, allowing infection to spread beneath the surface. In homes across America, the divide deepened. Neighbors argued. Churches split. Newspapers hardened their editorials. Slavery was no longer an issue confined to the South. It had become a national reckoning. The country had not found consensus. It had buried conflict beneath layers of legalese and denial. Every element of the compromise carried unintended consequences. The South became more aggressive in defending slavery. The North grew bolder in its opposition. The political center eroded. Extremes began to define the discourse, and moderation lost its appeal. What Clay and Douglass intended as a unifying gesture instead drew a deeper line in the sand. The United States now operated under the illusion of stability, while walking on a tightrope stretched over an abyss. And as the 1850s advanced, that rope began to fray. The Compromise of 1850 was supposed to bring peace, but within just a few years, the nation found itself engulfed in a new storm, this time centered not in Washington, but in the windswept prairies of Kansas. What began as a legal debate over how to organize new territory would soon descend into an inferno of violence, lawlessness, and bloodshed that shocked the nation. The name it would come to bear was simple but searing: Bleeding Kansas. The spark was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, proposed by Senator Stephen A. Douglas. Aimed at organizing the remaining Louisiana Purchase territories, the bill sought to apply popular sovereignty to Kansas and Nebraska, letting settlers vote on whether to allow slavery. On its surface, it was a return to democratic principle. But beneath it lay a calculated gamble that would shatter the fragile peace left behind by the Missouri Compromise. Douglas's bill repealed the Missouri Compromise line, the 36 degrees 30 minutes boundary that had prohibited slavery north of Missouri for over 30 years. With a stroke of the pen, decades of uneasy consensus were undone. The North erupted in fury. The South celebrated a rare legislative victory, and the vast, unsettled plains of Kansas became the new front line in a war for America's soul. Almost overnight, Kansas was flooded with settlers. Not just farmers and pioneers, but ideologues, zealots, and opportunists from both sides of the slavery debate. Abolitionists from the Northeast streamed in, organized and determined to ensure Kansas would be free. They were met with equal fervor by pro-slavery border ruffians from neighboring Missouri, who crossed the state line with rifles and ballot box stuffing tactics. At first, the conflict was political. Elections for the Territorial legislature in 1855 became battlegrounds for voter fraud and intimidation. Armed Missourians flooded into Kansas to swing the vote in favor of slavery. They succeeded, creating a pro-slavery legislature that immediately passed draconian laws punishing anti-slavery speech and aiding escaped slaves. But the anti-slavery settlers refused to yield. They formed their own shadow government in Topeka, rejected the fraudulent legislature, and petitioned Congress for statehood as a free state. Kansas now had two governments, two sets of laws, and two armed populations who viewed the other as illegitimate. Tension cracked into open violence. In May 1856, the town of Lawrence, a Free State stronghold, was sacked by a pro-slavery mob. Printing presses were smashed, homes looted, and the Free State Hotel set ablaze. The attack was brutal, but what followed would be even more shocking. In retaliation, a radical abolitionist named John Brown led a nighttime raid on a pro-slavery settlement at Pottawatomie Creek. There, he and his sons executed 5 men with broadswords in the dead of night. News of the massacre spread like wildfire. John Brown became either a hero or a terrorist, depending on which newspaper one read. The cycle of vengeance had begun. For the next several years, Kansas was less a territory than a war zone, where elections were fought with bullets and families slept with rifles by their beds. Clashes broke out across the land. Farms were torched, travelers ambushed, judges assassinated. Children watched their homes burned to ashes. The federal government proved incapable and often unwilling to control the chaos. Presidents came and went, but none could tame Kansas. It had become a test case for the future of America, and the nation was failing. The violence even reached the halls of Congress. After Senator Charles Sumner delivered a blistering anti-slavery speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," he was attacked on the Senate floor by South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks. Brooks struck Sumner repeatedly with a cane until he collapsed in blood. It took Sumner 3 years to physically recover. The nation never did. The caning of Sumner became a metaphor for the state of the Union. In the North, it was seen as barbarism, proof that the Southern slave power would use violence to silence dissent. In the South, Brooks was hailed as a hero. He was even sent new canes by supporters engraved with messages like, "Hit him again." By 1857, pro-slavery forces attempted to solidify their control by drafting the Lecompton Constitution, which would admit Kansas as a slave state. President James Buchanan supported it, but fierce opposition, led by Senator Douglass himself, fractured the Democratic Party. Congress ultimately rejected the document. Kansas still hung in limbo. Free state settlers, undeterred, continued to pour in. They formed militias, built schools, and voted in their own constitutional convention. By 1859, after years of struggle, the tide finally turned. Kansas drafted a free state constitution in Wyandotte and submitted it to Congress. But even then, its admission would be delayed by Southern opposition until 1861, on the eve of the Civil War. Bleeding Kansas left scars far beyond its borders. It radicalized a generation of Americans who had once believed in compromise. The center had collapsed. Moderates were drowned out by the screams of widows and the fire of abolitionist sermons. The violence in Kansas made clear the question of slavery would not be settled at the ballot box. And for John Brown, Kansas was just the beginning. He would carry his war to the east and to Harper's Ferry, where his final act would help ignite the powder keg. Bleeding Kansas was a crucible, a place where America's worst fears were realized. It revealed that slavery was not merely a Southern issue, but a national crisis, one that would only end in open war. The territory had lived up to its name, and in doing so, it had dragged the nation one step closer to the abyss. By 1857, the United States was teetering on the edge of rupture. The Compromise of 1850 had failed to soothe tensions. The fires of bleeding Kansas still burned. And into this volatile moment came a Supreme Court decision so inflammatory, so shocking, that it ripped through the fragile seams of the Union like a blade. Its name would become a stain on the nation's conscience. Dred Scott versus Sanford. The man at the center of this storm was no general, no politician. He was an enslaved black man born in Virginia and sold into bondage. Dred Scott's story was not unusual in its beginning, but it would become extraordinary in its consequence. His life, shaped by the cruelty of slavery, would eventually place him before the highest court in the land. Scott had been taken by his master, Dr. John Emerson, an army surgeon, to Illinois and then to the Wisconsin Territory, both free under federal law. There, Scott married, built a family, and lived for years in what was technically free soil. When Emerson died, Scott sought what he believed to be his right: freedom for himself, his wife, and their children. With the support of anti-slavery advocates and church groups, Scott sued for his liberty. His argument was simple yet powerful. Having lived in a free state, he should no longer be considered a slave. The legal precedent seemed clear. Other enslaved individuals had gained freedom through similar cases. But Scott's case would take a different path. The case bounced through courts for nearly a decade, slowly rising from Missouri's lower courts to the Supreme Court of the United States. By the time it reached Washington, D.C., the country was watching. The ruling would not merely determine Scott's fate. It would define the legal status of every black person in America. On March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney delivered the majority opinion. It was a ruling that would echo through history with devastating force. In one sweeping statement, the court declared that no black person, enslaved or free, could be a citizen of the United States. As such, Dred Scott had no right to even file a lawsuit. But Taney did not stop there. He went further, striking down the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. Congress, he claimed, had no authority to prohibit slavery in the territories. By this logic, slavery could not be legally barred from expanding anywhere in the country. It was a pro-slavery manifesto cloaked in judicial robes. The reaction was instant and explosive. In the North, the decision was met with horror and disbelief. Newspapers denounced the court. Churches rang their bells in protest. Abolitionists declared the ruling an abomination, proof that the federal government had become a tool of the slave power. In the South, the ruling was hailed as vindication. Plantation owners rejoiced. Politicians praised Taney's logic. To them, the court had confirmed what they believed all along: that slavery was not just legal but untouchable, protected, endorsed by the Constitution itself. For many Northerners, the Dred Scott decision marked a turning point. It exposed the depth of the Southern grip on federal institutions. The balance of power was no longer a compromise, it was a chokehold. Moderates who had once favored caution now began to see the Southern system as a threat to the very idea of American liberty. Republicans, led by Abraham Lincoln, seized on the decision as evidence that the slavocracy intended to nationalize slavery. Lincoln warned that the ruling laid the groundwork for future cases that could force free states to accept slavery within their borders. If that happened, he asked, what freedom would remain? Meanwhile, Dred Scott himself, the man at the heart of it all, remained in limbo. Though the Supreme Court had denied his legal claim, the public outcry led to a strange twist of fate. Irene Emerson, Scott's legal owner, had remarried a prominent abolitionist. Under pressure, she allowed the Scotts to be freed. Dred Scott lived his final years as a free man, but he died just 16 months after the decision that bore his name. His freedom came too late, but the injustice done in his name became a rallying cry. Scott's legacy would not be legal victory, but moral awakening. His case pierced the national delusion that compromise could continue indefinitely. The lines were now clear, and there would be no more middle ground. The court had overreached. Rather than settling a political question, it had inflamed it. Chief Justice Taney believed his ruling would put the slavery debate to rest. Instead, it became a match thrown into a powder keg. His opinion radicalized the North and emboldened the South. It made civil war not just likely, but inevitable. Dred Scott versus Sanford revealed the peril of a nation built on contradictions. The Constitution had promised liberty and equality, but had been born of compromise with bondage. Now the illusion was shattered. The law had spoken, and it had chosen chains over freedom. The ruling sent shockwaves through the 1860 election, strengthening the rising Republican Party and sharpening the divide between North and South. Abraham Lincoln, though still relatively unknown nationally, delivered powerful speeches condemning the decision as morally wrong and legally dangerous. His star began to rise, and so the nation drifted further apart. Courts could no longer serve as neutral arbiters. Congress was gridlocked. Violence had already erupted in Kansas. Now the Supreme Court, the supposed guardian of justice, had chosen a side. One rooted in cruelty, injustice, and racial subjugation. Dred Scott had become a symbol, not of victory, but of resistance. His name would echo not just in law books, but in the battle cries of Union soldiers, the speeches of abolitionists, and the ink of the Emancipation Proclamation yet to come. The breaking point had arrived, and with it, the path to war was now unmistakable. By 1859, the American nation stood on the brink of collapse. Years of legislative compromise, bloodshed in Kansas, and judicial betrayal had torn at the country's moral seams. But it would be the act of a single man, a gaunt, fiery-eyed abolitionist named John Brown, that would transform the slow burn of sectional tension into an explosive reckoning. John Brown was not a politician. He was not a general. He was not interested in speeches, votes, or moderation. He was a zealot, fueled by faith, rage, and a profound sense of divine justice. For Brown, slavery was not just a sin. It was a war crime that demanded not compromise, but confrontation. Brown's hatred of slavery had been forged in the fires of bleeding Kansas. There, he had taken justice into his own hands, brutally executing pro-slavery settlers at Pottawatomie Creek. To some, he was a madman. To others, a saint. But to Brown, he was merely an instrument of God's wrath. He believed that America could never purge its original sin without blood. And so he plotted not to debate or legislate, but to strike. His target would not be a plantation or a courtroom, but the very heart of Southern security. A federal arsenal in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His plan was as audacious as it was dangerous. With a small band of followers, including several of his sons, Brown aimed to seize the arsenal, distribute its weapons to enslaved men in the surrounding countryside, and ignite a massive uprising that would sweep across the South like wildfire. On the night of October 16, 1859, under the cloak of darkness and secrecy, Brown and his 21 followers descended upon Harper's Ferry. They cut telegraph lines, took hostages, and captured the armory with astonishing ease. For a moment, it seemed their rebellion might succeed. But the slaves did not rise. Brown had misjudged. His call to revolution was met not with rebellion, but with silence. Enslaved people, skeptical of white saviors or too afraid of brutal retaliation, did not flock to his cause. Meanwhile, local militias and townspeople responded with deadly force. Within hours, Brown and his men were trapped inside the engine house of the armory, barricaded, wounded, and vastly outnumbered. Among the responders was a young colonel sent by Washington to quell the uprising, Robert E. Lee. Alongside him was another future Confederate, J.E.B. Stuart. On October 18th, U.S. Marines stormed the engine house. Brown's men were killed or captured. He himself was wounded and taken into custody. The raid had lasted less than 48 hours, but its impact would echo for generations. Brown was placed on trial for treason against the state of Virginia. His fate was certain, but his spirit remained unbroken. Refusing to plead insanity, he instead delivered a chilling and prophetic statement before the court. I am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood. The trial became a national spectacle. In the North, abolitionists hailed Brown as a martyr. Churches rang bells in his honor. Ralph Waldo Emerson compared him to Christ. Meanwhile, the South recoiled in horror. Brown confirmed their deepest fears, that abolition was not just a political movement, but a violent threat. Southern slaveholders saw the raid not as the work of one man, but as the opening salvo of a Northern conspiracy. Paranoia spread. Militias were formed. Armed patrols increased. The South began preparing not just for rebellion but for war. On December 2, 1859, John Brown was hanged in Charlestown, Virginia. He ascended the scaffold with calm dignity, a Bible tucked under his arm. His final note, handed to a guard, read, "The crimes of this guilty land will never be purged but with blood." It was not a farewell. It was a prophecy. Brown died, but his legend only grew. Songs were written in his name, most famously John Brown's Body, sung by Union troops during the Civil War. His image, gaunt and ghost-like, became a banner for the abolitionist cause. His words haunted the conscience of the nation. Abraham Lincoln, though politically cautious, understood Brown's significance. He did not endorse the raid, but he recognized its moral force. "Old John Brown," he said, "has stirred the souls of men." Indeed, Brown had done what politicians could not. He had made slavery impossible to ignore. For the South, Brown's raid proved that compromise was no longer an option. The North, in their eyes, had declared war. And though Brown had failed in tactics, he had succeeded in message. Slavery would not end with laws, it would end with fire and steel. In the months that followed, the political landscape shifted dramatically. Secessionist voices grew louder. The 1860 presidential election loomed, with Abraham Lincoln rising as a symbol of Northern resolve. The nation, like John Brown, now stood on the gallows of history, facing a judgment of its own making. John Brown had been hanged, but his shadow stretched across the land. He had shown that the line between peaceful resistance and armed insurrection was growing thin. And with his death, the final warning had been delivered. The war had not yet begun, but it had been declared. The presidential election of 1860 was no ordinary contest. It was a national reckoning. The American experiment stood on the precipice of disintegration, and every ballot cast felt like a strike at the country's soul. The two visions of the nation, one rooted in liberty, the other in bondage, had become utterly irreconcilable. At the center of it all stood Abraham Lincoln, a man who had not yet held national office since a single term in Congress, yet whose name now struck fear across the South. Lincoln was not an abolitionist in the radical mold of John Brown. but he was clear in his convictions. He believed slavery was morally wrong and must not be allowed to expand into new territories. That position, mild by Northern standards, was seen by many Southerners as a death sentence for their way of life. The political center had evaporated. Extremes now held sway. Four major candidates ran for president in 1860, a symptom of a country coming apart at the seams. Lincoln represented the Republican Party, promising to stop the spread of slavery. Stephen A. Douglas, his old rival from the Lincoln-Douglas debates, ran as a Northern Democrat promoting popular sovereignty. Southern Democrats broke away to support John C. Breckinridge, who pledged to protect slavery in all territories. A fourth candidate, John Bell, ran on a vague platform of preserving the Union. The splintered vote reflected a nation already fractured. In the North, Lincoln gained enormous support, winning states like New York, Pennsylvania, and Illinois with strong majorities. In the South, his name didn't even appear on most ballots. The divide was no longer philosophical, it was geographical, cultural, and absolute. When the results were counted, Lincoln had secured the presidency with 180 electoral votes, without winning a single Southern state. His election was legal, legitimate, and democratic. But to the Southern elite it was intolerable. They saw it not as a defeat, but as a declaration of war. If a president could be elected without any Southern support, what power did they truly have left? South Carolina wasted no time. Just weeks after the election, on December 20, 1860, its legislature voted unanimously to secede from the Union. The state issued a secession declaration filled with grievance, warning that a geographical line has been drawn across the Union, and all the states north of that line have united in the election of a man hostile to slavery. The message was unmistakable. Slavery was not just a Southern institution, it was their identity, and it was now under threat. Within weeks, 6 more states, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas, followed South Carolina's lead. The Confederate States of America was born. The outgoing president, James Buchanan, watched helplessly. Lame duck and indecisive, he refused to act. His inaction allowed Southern leaders to organize, arm, and prepare. By the time Lincoln was sworn in on March 4, 1861, the Union was already fractured, and the Confederacy had elected its own president, Jefferson Davis. In his inaugural address, Lincoln struck a tone of unity and reason. He promised not to interfere with slavery where it already existed, hoping to cool Southern fears. But he also warned, "The Union is perpetual. No state upon its own mere motion can lawfully get out of the Union." The message was clear. Secession was not a right, it was rebellion. But by then, the political dialogue had collapsed. Southern newspapers denounced Lincoln as a tyrant, a black Republican plotting racial upheaval. In the North, many saw secession as treason. Tensions escalated with every passing day, and the question became not whether war would come, but when. The Confederacy moved swiftly to consolidate power. They seized federal forts, arsenals, and customs houses throughout the South. The U.S. flag was pulled down from buildings across the seceded states, replaced by the new emblem of the Confederacy. One fort remained defiantly under Union control, Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The standoff at Fort Sumter became a test of wills. Lincoln, unwilling to recognize secession but hesitant to provoke violence, sent a supply ship to resupply the garrison. The Confederacy, now claiming sovereignty, demanded that the Union vacate the fort. When Major Robert Anderson refused, the decision was made. On April 12, 1861, At 4:30 in the morning, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter. The sky over Charleston erupted with cannon smoke. The Civil War had begun. The bombardment lasted 34 hours. The Union defenders returned fire, but they were hopelessly outgunned and under-resourced. On April 13th, Anderson surrendered. The Confederates raised their flag over the fort, jubilant in victory. But what they had won was not peace, it was war. The attack galvanized the North. Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Men flocked to enlistment centers, driven by duty, patriotism, and outrage. But the South, too, was inflamed. For more states, Virginia, Arkansas, North Carolina, and Tennessee, joined the Confederacy, unwilling to fight their fellow Southerners. Suddenly, what had seemed like a distant crisis was now an all-consuming fire. Families were split, towns divided. Some brothers joined the Union Army, others the Confederacy. The house divided had not stood, it had cracked in two. Lincoln, somber and determined, now bore a burden no American president had ever known. He had inherited a fractured country and was tasked with preserving its soul. "We are not enemies," he had said, but the time for words had passed. The battlefield would now decide. As April turned to May, the nation mobilized. Armies were raised. Forts were fortified. The political crisis of the past decade had transformed into full-scale war. The great American experiment, once a beacon of liberty, had now become a battleground. The collapse of the Union was complete, and in its ruins stood two flags, two presidents, and two visions of America. Only one would survive. As the gray dawn of April 1861 broke over Charleston Harbor, the nation stood suspended between peace and catastrophe. For months, the tension had crackled like lightning behind storm clouds, but no thunder had yet sounded. Now, in the low waters of South Carolina's coast, that silence was about to be shattered by cannon fire. Fort Sumter was more than just a pile of masonry and guns. It was a symbol, a Union stronghold planted defiantly in Confederate territory. Major Robert Anderson, a Kentucky-born career officer loyal to the Union, commanded a small garrison of 85 men. Isolated, undersupplied, and surrounded by Confederate artillery, they stood as the final outpost of federal authority in the rebellious South. The Confederacy, meanwhile, had made its position clear. Sumter was an affront to Southern sovereignty. For them, the presence of Union troops in Charleston Harbor was not a defensive posture. It was an occupation. President Jefferson Davis, newly inaugurated, faced a choice: tolerate this humiliation or act and assert the legitimacy of his new nation. In Washington, Abraham Lincoln, barely a month into his presidency, wrestled with his own impossible decision. To surrender the fort would signal weakness and legitimize secession, but to reinforce it could provoke war. Lincoln opted for a third path, a peaceful resupply. A relief fleet would sail to Sumter carrying food, not weapons, unless fired upon. The message was both careful and firm. The Union would not initiate violence, but it would not abandon its flag. South Carolina's leaders were unmoved. The arrival of the fleet, they claimed, was an act of aggression. And so, on April 11th, Confederate General P.G.T. Beauregard sent a demand to Major Anderson: evacuate the fort or face attack. Anderson refused. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, as a sleepy harbor lay beneath a cloudy sky, a single mortar round arced through the darkness from Fort Johnson. It burst above Fort Sumter with a thunderous roar, the signal for war. Confederate batteries opened fire in unison, and the first shots of the American Civil War echoed across the waters. The bombardment was relentless. Shells screamed through the air, crashing into Sumter's thick walls, collapsing masonry and setting buildings ablaze. Inside the fort, Anderson's men scrambled to return fire with limited ammunition and no hope of reinforcement. They endured for 34 hours under a storm of iron and flame. Across Charleston, civilians climbed rooftops and filled windows to watch the spectacle unfold. Some brought picnic baskets, believing the shelling would be swift and decisive. They cheered each Confederate volley, unaware that they were witnessing the start of a 4-year nightmare. Despite the chaos, there was a strange, grim nobility inside the fort. Anderson's men, cut off from water and running low on food, continued to fire their cannons with deliberate precision. At one point, the flagpole was shot down. Union troops braved the rain of shells to raise the stars and stripes once again. But by April 13th, the situation had become untenable. Fire had spread through the interior. Ammunition was nearly gone. Rather than sacrifice his men, Anderson agreed to surrender. The terms were generous. His garrison would evacuate with dignity, saluting their flag as they left. And so, with drums rolling and banners furled, the Union troops marched out of Fort Sumter. The Confederacy had secured its first victory, not just militarily but symbolically. The South had fired the first shot, and the Union had not retaliated in kind. But the illusion of restraint would not last. In Washington, news of the bombardment arrived like a slap. Lincoln, until now cautious and measured, acted with urgency. On April 15th, he issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was immediate. Across the North, men surged into recruiting offices. Cities erupted in patriotic fervor. The flag, once taken for granted, now commanded fierce devotion. But in the South, Lincoln's call to arms had a different effect. For more states, Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas, refused to send troops against their southern neighbors. Instead, they joined the Confederacy. What had begun as a rebellion by 7 states now became a full-scale regional revolt. With the firing on Fort Sumter, the line between dissent and war had vanished. The Union, once fragile and splintered, now unified behind a shared cause, to preserve the Republic. The Confederacy, its honor staked on its first victory, prepared for the fight of its life. The battle itself had cost no lives in direct combat, but its consequences would be measured in blood. Over the next 4 years, more than 600,000 Americans would perish in battlefields stretching from Pennsylvania to Louisiana. Fort Sumter became hallowed ground, not for what it destroyed, but for what it unleashed. The smoke that rose above Charleston that April morning marked not the end of a conflict, but the beginning of the bloodiest chapter in American history. And as the battered Union flag was lowered over the fort, one era ended, and another of fire, steel, and sacrifice had begun. The thunder of Fort Sumter's guns had barely faded before the nation hurtled into chaos. What had begun as a symbolic clash soon became a national awakening, one drenched not in rhetoric, but in blood. The illusion that this would be a quick or clean war evaporated within weeks, replaced by a grim realization. America was now at war with itself, and neither side truly understood what lay ahead. Abraham Lincoln, shaken but resolute, faced an impossible task. With just a skeleton army at his disposal, he called for 75,000 volunteers. The North responded with patriotic fervor. young men flooding enlistment offices, convinced they'd be home by Christmas. Bands played, flags waved, mothers wept with pride. But it was all built on fantasy. In the South, the mood was equally charged. The firing on Fort Sumter was seen as a glorious beginning, a validation of independence and Southern resolve. The Confederate government moved swiftly, organizing militias, printing currency, and establishing its capital in Richmond, Virginia. President Jefferson Davis prepared for war not merely as defense, but as destiny. Both sides believed they were righteous. Both claimed to defend liberty, heritage, and honor. But as they mustered armies and mapped strategies, neither the Union nor the Confederacy grasped the scale of the storm they were about to unleash. War fever blinded many to the cost that lay ahead. The first real battle came not on grand terrain, but on the rolling fields of Northern Virginia. In July 1861, Union General Irvin McDowell led 35,000 Green troops toward Manassas Junction, hoping to strike a blow in March on Richmond. Civilian spectators followed with picnic baskets, expecting a grand show. What they witnessed was a nightmare. The Battle of Bull Run, known to the Confederates as the Battle of Manassas, was chaos. Union troops, inexperienced and poorly led, clashed with determined Confederate forces under Generals Beauregard and Joseph E. Johnston. Amid the smoke and confusion, it was a Virginian brigade under General Thomas Jackson that held firm, inspiring the nickname Stonewall. As Union forces collapsed under the pressure of a surprise Confederate counterattack, panic set in. Soldiers fled in disorder, tangled with the watching civilians. What had begun as a confident march ended in a chaotic retreat back to Washington. The dream of a quick war died that day on the banks of Bull Run. The North was stunned. The press turned on McDowell. Lincoln, with heavy heart, replaced him with General George B. McClellan, a young, ambitious officer with a gift for organization. McClellan quickly rebuilt the Army of the Potomac, turning it into a formidable force, but his caution and distrust of Lincoln would prove costly in months to come. For the South, Bull Run was a euphoric victory, but also a dangerous one. It bred overconfidence. Many believed that one more blow might bring the North to its knees. But Davis understood better. He knew the Union's resources were vast, and that holding the Confederacy together would take more than battlefield triumphs. Meanwhile, skirmishes erupted along the borders, in Missouri, Kentucky, and Western Virginia. These regions became bloody tug-of-wars, where loyalties were divided, and neighbors turned on neighbors. In Missouri, the Battle of Wilson's Creek saw Union forces under General Nathaniel Lyon pushed back by Confederate troops, a costly defeat in the fight for the border states. Kentucky declared neutrality, but both sides courted its allegiance. Control of the Ohio River and vital railways made it strategically essential. Soon, neutrality collapsed under the weight of invasion, and Kentucky became a battleground. Families were torn apart as brothers joined opposing armies. In the mountains of Western Virginia, Unionist sentiment ran strong. With the support of federal troops, counties began seceding from secession itself, eventually forming a new state, West Virginia. It was a strange twist of war, one part of a rebel state rejoining the Union, while the rest dug in for a long rebellion. Naval warfare also flared along the Atlantic coast. Union blockades, part of the Anaconda Plan, aimed to choke the Confederacy economically by sealing off its ports. In response, Confederate privateers prowled the seas, harassing Union shipping and building a makeshift navy of their own. The South's resourcefulness became a hallmark of the conflict. As summer turned to fall, the war took on a new, more somber tone. Casualty lists grew. Letters from the front spoke not of glory, but of exhaustion, sickness, and mud. The early romanticism of war faded quickly under the weight of disease and death. Both sides were forced to reckon with inadequate infrastructure. Supplies ran short. Uniforms were mismatched. Rifles were scarce. Camp conditions were appalling, and disease often killed more men than bullets. Yet still, the armies grew, as new waves of volunteers and conscripts joined the ranks. In Washington, Lincoln faced mounting pressure. Critics questioned his leadership, his handling of generals, and his use of wartime powers. But Lincoln remained focused not on revenge, but on preserving the Union. His resolve was quiet, but unshakable. "This country," he wrote, "with its institutions, belongs to the people who inhabit it." Across the South, Davis faced his own challenges. He struggled to unite states fiercely protective of their sovereignty. The Confederate Constitution, while modeled on the U.S. version, prioritized states' rights, making coordination difficult. And while the South's generals showed brilliance, its infrastructure lagged far behind the North's. By the end of 1861, both sides had suffered, but neither had broken. The war, once imagined as a matter of weeks, had revealed its true nature: protracted, complex, and brutally unforgiving. The romantic illusions had been shattered. What remained was steel, smoke, and sorrow. The early clashes were not decisive, but they were transformative. They stripped away pretense. They revealed the scale of the conflict to come. They hardened both resolve and resentment. And they set the stage for a war that would reshape the American continent and the American soul. While the Eastern theater of the Civil War drew the most attention from politicians and newspapers, it was in the vast expanse of the West, between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, where the war's momentum quietly shifted. Here, amid thick forests, muddy rivers, and rural strongholds, the Union would discover both fierce resistance and unexpected opportunities. The Western theater became a crucible of strategy, brutality, and raw determination. In early 1862, Union military planners set their sights on the Mississippi River. Controlling it would sever the Confederacy in two, choking off supplies from the West and splitting its forces. To do this, they needed two things: control of key rivers and a commander bold enough to seize them. That commander emerged from obscurity: Ulysses S. Grant. A quiet, rumpled figure with a reputation for drinking and failure, Grant was far from the image of a dashing general. Yet beneath the surface burned a relentless tenacity. Grant didn't crave glory, he simply refused to lose. In February, Grant struck his first blows. Leading Union forces alongside the Navy's ironclads under Flag Officer Andrew Foote, he captured Fort Henry on the Tennessee River, then swiftly pivoted to Fort Donelson on the Cumberland. When Confederate General Simon Bolivar Buckner requested surrender terms, Grant famously replied, "No terms except unconditional and immediate surrender." The Union's capture of Fort Donelson electrified the North. Thousands of Confederate troops were taken prisoner, and Tennessee, once firmly Confederate, began to crack. Nashville, a vital industrial hub, fell without a fight, becoming the first Confederate state capital seized by Union forces. But the most brutal reckoning came weeks later at Shiloh, along the Tennessee River near the Mississippi border. On April 6, 1862, Confederate forces under Generals Albert Sidney Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard launched a surprise attack on Grant's army encamped near Pittsburgh Landing. It was a thunderous, blood-soaked ambush that nearly annihilated the Union line. The first day was a slaughter. Confederate soldiers surged through Union camps, bayoneting men in their tents. The Hornet's Nest, a sunken road, became a scene of desperate Union resistance and staggering losses. General Johnston, the South's top field commander, was mortally wounded while leading a charge. For hours, it seemed Grant's forces would be driven into the river. But Grant held. Reinforcements under General Don Carlos Buell arrived overnight, and the tide turned. On April 7th, Union troops counterattacked with fury. By the end of the second day, the battered Confederates withdrew. Shiloh had been won, but at staggering cost. Over 23,000 men lay dead, wounded, or missing. The sheer carnage stunned both North and South. The war, people now understood, would be no gentleman's duel. It would be a meat grinder. And the West was not immune to its horrors. Despite the bloodshed, Union forces continued pressing southward. The Mississippi River remained the ultimate prize. To control it, they would need to capture the Confederacy's greatest river city, Vicksburg, a fortress on a high bluff above a bend in the Mississippi, defended by steep hills, swamps, and determined troops. Before Vicksburg could be assaulted, the Union turned to naval power. Admiral David Farragut led a daring campaign up the Mississippi, capturing New Orleans, the South's largest city, in April 1862. It was a major strategic and symbolic blow, depriving the Confederacy of a vital economic hub and closing off access to the Gulf of Mexico. As Grant pushed deeper into Mississippi, Confederate resistance stiffened. Skirmishes flared across western Tennessee and northern Mississippi, where cavalry raids and ambushes blurred the lines between battles and terror. Civilians were drawn into the conflict, facing destruction, looting, and occupation. The Western theater also revealed one of the war's most transformative aspects: the rise of African American resistance. As Union forces advanced, enslaved people fled plantations and sought protection behind Union lines. Many would soon take up arms themselves, forming the first black regiments and altering the moral and political stakes of the war. But the fight for Mississippi was far from over. The campaign to take Vicksburg would test Grant's endurance, resourcefulness, and courage. It would require months of maneuvering, deception, and siege warfare before the city finally fell in 1863. But even in 1862, the seeds of that victory were being sown in the bloody fields of the West. The Confederate High Command recognized the threat. Reinforcements were sent west, including troops under the command of General Braxton Bragg. But their arrival only delayed the inevitable. Union strength was building. Rail lines were seized. Supply depots destroyed. Slowly, methodically, the North tightened its grip. In towns like Corinth, Memphis, and Baton Rouge, the war became a daily fact of life. Occupation forces established Union control, often facing guerrilla attacks and sabotage. Churches became hospitals. Schools became barracks. The civilian world was dissolving into a permanent state of siege. By the end of 1862, the Western theater was transforming into the engine room of Union victory. Here, away from the political drama of Washington and the media focus on Virginia, the North was making tangible gains, capturing cities, splitting Confederate territory, and draining Southern morale. Grant emerged not as a charismatic figurehead, but as a hammer, unyielding, methodical, and dangerous. His victories brought him national attention and the favor of President Lincoln, who saw in Grant something other generals lacked: the will to fight without excuse. Mississippi's bloody banks had become the proving ground of the Union's new war, total, unrelenting, and strategically ruthless. What was once a rebellion had become a siege on every front, and the Mississippi River flowed red with the price of progress. As the year closed, both sides bled and regrouped. But the momentum had shifted. The Confederacy had not broken, but it had bent. And Grant was far from finished. By late 1862, the Civil War had reached a fever pitch. Across the East and West, rivers of blood had been spilled, yet neither side had dealt a conclusive blow. Confederate hopes rested on a bold new gamble, an invasion of the North. If successful, it could force foreign recognition, demoralize the Union, and perhaps end the war in Southern favor. The man tasked with this daring strike was General Robert E. Lee. Fresh from a string of victories in Virginia, Lee pushed northward into Maryland. He believed the time was ripe. Maryland was a slave state with mixed loyalties, and he hoped its citizens might rise in rebellion. His Army of Northern Virginia crossed the Potomac in September, tattered but emboldened. The North, already weary from defeats, watched anxiously. President Lincoln, frustrated by General McClellan's months of inaction, now found him the only general close enough to block Lee's advance. Despite McClellan's cautious nature and strained relationship with the White House, he was placed back in command. The fate of the Union would once more rest in his hands. Then came a stroke of luck. Outside Frederick, Maryland, Union troops discovered Special Order 191, a copy of Lee's invasion plans wrapped around cigars and left behind by a careless Confederate officer. It revealed that Lee had dangerously divided his army. McClellan now held the most valuable intelligence of the war. The window to strike was narrow, but would he act swiftly? McClellan, ever cautious, hesitated just long enough for Lee to realize the vulnerability and begin reuniting his forces near the small town of Sharpsburg, Maryland, along Antietam Creek. There, on the quiet farmlands and golden cornfields, two armies, totaling over 100,000 men, prepared for battle. What followed would be the bloodiest single day in American history. On the morning of September 17, 1862, the Union Army struck first. At dawn, Union General Joseph Hooker's corps surged into the Confederate left, where cornfields swayed in the early light. What seemed like a field of gold quickly became a slaughterhouse. Men fired blindly through the tall stalks. The dead fell in heaps. One Union officer described the field as mowed as if by a scythe. The cornfield became a killing ground. Hooker's men were driven back. Union reinforcements pushed in, only to be met by fresh waves of Confederate defenders under Stonewall Jackson. For hours the field changed hands. Smoke thickened. Blood pooled. Thousands perished in the span of minutes. And it was only the beginning. Next came the sunken road, a worn wagon path where Confederate troops took up a strong defensive position. Union forces under Generals French and Richardson charged the position again and again, their bodies stacking along the embankment. Eventually, the Confederates cracked and the sunken road was captured, but at a terrible cost. It would forever be known as Bloody Lane. Further south, Union General Ambrose Burnside attempted to cross a narrow stone bridge over Antietam Creek. Confederate sharpshooters perched above the ravine poured fire into his ranks. For 3 hours, Union troops were pinned down in a death trap. Only after repeated assaults did they finally seize the bridge. But the delay gave Lee time to bring in reinforcements from Harper's Ferry. The day dragged on in brutal, unrelenting cycles of attack and defense. Men fell by the thousands, cut down in orchards, trampled in creek beds, blown apart by cannon fire. Entire units were annihilated. At times, the fighting was so close that soldiers stabbed one another with bayonets amid the screams of the wounded. When the sun finally dipped below the horizon, the fields fell eerily silent. The battlefield was a vision of hell. Over 22,000 men had been killed, wounded, or gone missing. Corpses littered the ground. Limbs lay scattered. Blood soaked the earth. No other day in the Civil War or American history would see so much death. Yet, despite the carnage, the battle was tactically inconclusive. Lee's army had held firm, but his invasion had stalled. McClellan, believing he had won a great victory, refused to pursue Lee's retreating forces across the Potomac. The opportunity to destroy the Confederate army had been lost again, due to his caution. Still, the political impact of Antietam was enormous. It ended Lee's first invasion of the North, restored Union morale, and provided Abraham Lincoln the victory he needed to issue his long-awaited Emancipation Proclamation. On September 22, 1862, just days after the battle, Lincoln announced that all slaves in rebelling states would be declared free as of January 1, 1863. It transformed the war's purpose from preserving the Union to ending slavery. Europe, watching closely, recoiled from aiding the Confederacy. The war had taken a moral turn. The dead were buried in shallow graves. Farmers returned to shattered fields. Families received telegrams of loss. But the war pressed on. Antietam had changed the course of the conflict, but it had also revealed its cost. Terrible, unrelenting, and human. For those who walked the battlefield afterward, among the scorched corn, the bloody road, the broken bridge, the war was no longer about flags or causes. It was about survival. Antietam had become a graveyard for illusions, and the gateway to a darker, more determined phase of war. And as the sun set on that terrible day, the Union flag still flew, but so did the shadow of all that would follow. The cannons of Antietam had barely cooled when Abraham Lincoln made his move. For over a year, he had walked a tightrope, balancing the need to preserve the Union with the fragile loyalty of slaveholding border states. But now, with a bloody yet strategic victory in hand, he turned the tide of war with words, not weapons. On September 22, 1862, Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It declared that as of January 1, 1863, all slaves in the Confederate-held territories would be, then, thenceforward, and forever free. It was not immediate abolition everywhere, but it was a thunderclap across the American conscience. Lincoln had always loathed slavery, but as president, he had placed the Union above all. Emancipation, however, was now both a moral necessity and a tactical weapon. By linking the war to freedom, he changed its soul. No longer was it just a battle for territory, it was a battle for the human spirit. The proclamation had its limits. It only applied to areas in active rebellion, not to slave states loyal to the Union like Kentucky or Missouri. But its symbolism was monumental. It redefined the war's purpose, placed the Confederacy firmly on the wrong side of history, and opened the gates for enslaved people to take fate into their own hands. Reactions were swift and divided. In the North, abolitionists rejoiced. Frederick Douglass, the famed orator and former slave, hailed it as the beginning of the end of slavery in the United States. Churches rang their bells. Hymns of liberation echoed in the streets. But others in the Union balked. Northern Democrats warned of racial unrest and job competition. Newspapers predicted chaos. Some soldiers deserted, claiming they had enlisted to preserve the Union, not to fight for the freedom of others. Yet Lincoln stood firm. "If slavery is not wrong," he wrote, "nothing is wrong." In the South, the proclamation ignited fury. Southern leaders accused Lincoln of inciting insurrection. It confirmed their worst fears. that this war was not just political, but apocalyptic for their way of life. Enslaved people were now seen not merely as property, but as potential soldiers, saboteurs, and revolutionaries. And indeed, enslaved people responded. Across the Confederacy, news of the proclamation spread like fire, carried by whispers, Union soldiers, and the wind of hope. Thousands fled plantations, risking death to cross into Union lines. Entire families escaped under cover of night. For the first time, freedom had a direction. Lincoln authorized the creation of black regiments, a revolutionary move. The idea of African Americans in uniform terrified Confederate leaders and unsettled many in the North. But black men volunteered in droves. They were not just fighting for a country, they were fighting for themselves, for their kin, for dignity. The most famous of these was the 54th Massachusetts Infantry Regiment, led by Colonel Robert Gould Shaw. Composed of freedmen and northern-born African Americans, the regiment would later prove its valor in the assault on Fort Wagner. But even before battle, their very existence was revolutionary, a living answer to centuries of dehumanization. Emancipation also shifted international opinion. Britain and France, once tempted to recognize the Confederacy for their cotton needs, recoiled from aligning with a slave power. Lincoln had framed the war as a struggle of liberty versus bondage. And in a world increasingly hostile to slavery, neutrality now meant complicity. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the final Emancipation Proclamation. The White House was quiet that morning. When he picked up the pen, his hand trembled, exhausted from shaking hands at a New Year's reception. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it'll be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." Across the Union, black churches held services of celebration. In the South, enslaved people gathered in secret, praying for the day their shackles would fall. It was not complete freedom, but it was the first real blow struck by law against the institution that had haunted America since its birth. Military commanders now had orders to protect escaped slaves and enlist them. Formerly enslaved men dug trenches, carried stretchers, and stood watch alongside white soldiers. Others joined guerrilla efforts, burning plantations, guiding Union scouts, and undermining Confederate logistics. Yet racism remained deeply rooted. Black soldiers were often paid less than their white counterparts, given menial tasks, and subjected to cruel discipline. Confederate troops who captured black soldiers sometimes executed them on the spot. But despite the danger, they fought on with courage, fury, and unmatched resolve. For Lincoln, emancipation was both an act of justice and a gamble. It risked alienating parts of the North, but it also infused the war with moral clarity. It elevated the Union cause. It ensured that victory would not just restore a broken nation, but redeem it. By transforming the war into a crusade for freedom, Lincoln ensured that peace, when it came, would be lasting and meaningful. The Union would not simply be stitched back together. It would be reborn, purified through struggle. As the smoke of 1863 began to rise, the war grew bloodier, more desperate. But beneath the carnage, something unshakable was taking root. The proclamation was not merely a document, it was a declaration of moral war. And its power would echo across the battlefield, the courtroom, and the soul of a nation for generations to come. The summer of 1863 found the Civil War at a dangerous crossroads. In the West, Grant laid siege to Vicksburg, strangling the Confederacy's access to the Mississippi. In the East, Robert E. Lee saw an opportunity. to strike into Northern Territory once more and force a decisive blow that might end the war. Morale in the South was faltering. Supplies were low. But if Lee could defeat the Union on its own soil, he believed peace might follow. Lee's second invasion of the North was bold, sweeping his army of Northern Virginia through the Shenandoah Valley into Pennsylvania. Behind him, Confederate troops sang triumphantly as they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. In front of him lay fertile farmlands, Union railroads, and the hope that a crushing defeat might force Abraham Lincoln to negotiate. Opposing Lee was Union General George G. Meade, newly appointed just days before the clash. Meade had little time to organize, but he had the benefit of interior lines and an army determined not to allow another Confederate incursion into the North. As Lee pushed deeper, both armies converged, by fate more than plan, on a quiet Pennsylvania town, Gettysburg. The first day of battle, July 1st, erupted suddenly. Confederate forces stumbled upon Union cavalry under General John Buford. Buford, recognizing the terrain's importance, held the high ground west of town until reinforcements arrived. By afternoon, both armies were pouring into the fields, and the Confederates pushed Union troops through Gettysburg to defensive positions on Cemetery Hill. Though the Confederates claimed the ground that day, Union forces held the strategic heights, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, and Little Round Top. Lee saw an opening. If he could dislodge the Union from their ridgeline defenses, victory was within reach. But his corps commanders, Longstreet and Ewell, hesitated. The chance for a swift Confederate breakthrough slipped away. July 2nd brought horror. Lee ordered attacks on both Union flanks. To the south, fierce fighting erupted at Peach Orchard, Devil's Den, and Little Round Top. Union Colonel Joshua Chamberlain, commanding the 20th Maine, anchored the far left of the line. Low on ammunition, outnumbered, and nearly surrounded, Chamberlain ordered a desperate bayonet charge. It succeeded, saving the Union left from collapse. To the north, Confederate forces stormed Culp's Hill, attempting to flank the Union right. There, under the cover of darkness and dense woods, the men fought in brutal close quarters. But the Union line bent, never broke. Meade's defensive strategy held. The next day, July 3rd, Lee made a fateful decision. Believing the Union center had been weakened, he ordered an all-out frontal assault. Pickett's charge would send 12,500 Confederate soldiers across open fields toward the heart of the Union line, an act of audacity, desperation, or both. At 1 p.m., 150 Confederate cannons opened fire, shaking the earth with thunderous fury. Union guns roared back, the air filled with smoke and shrapnel. For 2 hours, artillery battered both sides. Then came silence, and then the march. Across the mile-wide open ground, Confederate troops emerged from the smoke. Straight lines, bayonets fixed, flags high. Union artillery ripped through their ranks. Men fell by the hundreds. Still, they advanced, stepping over the bodies of comrades. As they neared the Union line, musket fire poured down like a storm. The Confederates reached the stone wall, briefly breaking the line in a place forever after known as the high water mark of the Confederacy. But Union reinforcements swarmed in. The breach was sealed. The charge failed. Over half of Pickett's division lay dead or wounded. General Lee, Pickett would later say, "I have no division." Lee, watching from Seminary Ridge, quietly said, "It's all my fault." He rode among his shattered men, asking their forgiveness. The invincible mystique of Robert E. Lee was broken. The Battle of Gettysburg was over. The Confederates had lost nearly 28,000 men, over a third of their army. Union casualties were equally staggering, at more than 23,000. Fields were covered in the dead. The wounded groaned from barns, churches, and porches. Surgeons worked with saws and no anesthesia. The town became a vast open-air hospital. Lee retreated back to Virginia. Meade, cautious like his predecessors, did not pursue aggressively. Lincoln was grateful for the victory but disappointed at the missed chance to destroy Lee's army. Still, Gettysburg marked a turning point. Never again would the Confederacy carry the war into Northern soil. 4 months later, on November 19, 1863, President Lincoln traveled to Gettysburg to dedicate a cemetery for the Union dead. His speech, the Gettysburg Address, was brief, just 272 words, but transcendent. He spoke of a new birth of freedom and of a government of the people, by the people, for the people. In those few lines, he redefined the nation's purpose. Gettysburg became more than a battle, it became a symbol of sacrifice, of resilience, of the terrible cost of civil war. It marked the moment the Union seized the moral and military initiative, though the road to final victory remained long and bloody. For the Confederacy, Gettysburg was the beginning of the end. Their high tide had crested and now began to ebb. From that point forward, they would fight on the defensive, outnumbered and outsupplied, as the Union forces grew stronger and more determined. And for America, Gettysburg stood forever as hallowed ground, a place where the nation's soul was tested and, though bloodied, endured. With the Mississippi firmly in Union hands and Vicksburg fallen, the tide of war had turned. Yet the Confederacy, though battered and split, remained unbroken. Its industrial heart still beat in Georgia, its railroads carried men and material, and its spirit endured in cities like Chattanooga and Atlanta, targets now squarely in the Union's crosshairs. Chattanooga, nestled between rugged mountains and crisscrossed by vital rail lines, was more than a strategic prize. It was the gateway to the Deep South. Whoever controlled it could strike into Georgia, Alabama, and beyond. For the Union, it was the next step in strangling the Confederacy. For the South, it was a line that could not be crossed. In September 1863, Union General William Rosecrans advanced into northern Georgia, hoping to drive Confederate forces out of Chattanooga. But Confederate General Braxton Bragg, reinforced by men under James Longstreet, counterattacked at Chickamauga Creek, a dense wilderness where clarity vanished and blood ran deep. The Battle of Chickamauga was the most significant Confederate victory in the West. Union lines fractured when miscommunication created a fatal gap. Longstreet's troops surged through, and panic followed. But not all crumbled. Union General George H. Thomas, holding firm amid chaos, earned the title the Rock of Chickamauga for his stand. Rosecrans retreated into Chattanooga. Bragg pursued, encircling the city and laying siege. Supplies dwindled. Union troops, starving and desperate, gnawed on raw flour and rancid meat. Yet they held on, hoping for relief. Lincoln responded swiftly, dispatching troops, generals, and a new commander, Ulysses S. Grant. Grant arrived in October and quickly revitalized the situation. He opened the Cracker Line, a supply route through Lookout Valley, bringing food and ammunition to the beleaguered troops. Morale surged. The Union was back in the fight. Bragg, meanwhile, failed to act decisively. His fractured command struggled with internal rivalries and mistrust. Confederate unity, already strained, was unraveling. Grant saw an opportunity and struck. In November 1863, Union forces launched a bold counteroffensive. The Battle of Lookout Mountain, fought amid swirling fog and steep cliffs, became legend as the battle above the clouds. Union troops scaled the mountain's face, bayonets gleaming, banners waving in the mist. The Confederates were stunned and driven back. The next day, Union forces attacked Missionary Ridge. In a breathtaking moment of spontaneous courage, Union soldiers, ordered only to seize the rifle pits at the base, charged all the way up the ridge, overrunning Confederate defenses. Bragg's army broke and fled. Chattanooga was secure. The victory electrified the North. Grant had proven, once again, that relentless action and bold strategy could break even the most daunting obstacles. Lincoln, deeply impressed, appointed him general-in-chief of all Union armies. The war's final phase would now take shape under Grant's iron resolve. But the road to final victory ran through Georgia, and at its heart lay Atlanta, a city teeming with railroads, munitions factories, and Confederate determination. Taking Atlanta would not just cripple Southern logistics. It would shatter morale and bolster Lincoln's struggling bid for re-election. To seize it, Grant entrusted General William Tecumseh Sherman, a fiery, controversial figure with a brilliant military mind. Sherman was not merely a tactician. He was a visionary of total war, willing to destroy infrastructure and spirit alike to end the conflict. In May 1864, Sherman launched the Atlanta Campaign, leading 100,000 men through rugged terrain against Confederate General Joseph E. Johnston, a cautious commander skilled in defense. What followed was a brutal chess match, Sherman outflanking, Johnston retreating, again and again. Though Johnston preserved his army, he gave up territory inch by inch. Confederate President Jefferson Davis, impatient and distrustful, replaced him with the aggressive but reckless General John Bell Hood. Hood attacked repeatedly and bled his army dry. By July 1864, Sherman reached Atlanta's gates. Fierce battles raged at Peachtree Creek, Atlanta, and Ezra Church. The city burned and reeled, its defenders stretched to the breaking point. Inside, civilians faced bombardments, food shortages, and terror. Sherman's artillery shelled Atlanta for weeks, reducing homes, factories, and hopes to ash. On September 2, 1864, Hood evacuated. Union troops entered the smoldering city. The fall of Atlanta sent shockwaves through the nation. For the North, it was salvation. Lincoln's chances for re-election had seemed dim, but Atlanta's fall reversed his fortunes. The war, once seen as a bloody stalemate, now looked winnable. Voters rallied behind the president and the cause of union and emancipation. Sherman, now infamous in the South, did not stop. He would soon launch his infamous march to the sea, carving a fiery path across Georgia to break the South's will entirely. But even before that campaign began, Atlanta had already become a turning point. Chattanooga had opened the door. Atlanta had shattered the hinges. The Deep South was now exposed, vulnerable, and bleeding. The Confederacy was on the defensive, every mile harder to hold, every army stretched thin. What began in the mountains of Tennessee ended in the burning streets of Atlanta. From the ashes rose a new phase of war, merciless, unyielding, and closer to final victory than ever before. The fall of Atlanta had stunned the Confederacy, but for General William Tecumseh Sherman, it was only the beginning. With the rail hub in Union hands and Confederate armies scattered, Sherman proposed a bold plan that horrified his peers. A march through the heart of Georgia, from Atlanta to Savannah, without supply lines, foraging from the land and destroying everything of military value in his path. It was the embodiment of total war. Sherman believed that to end the conflict, the South's ability, and will to fight must be utterly dismantled. This wasn't just a military campaign, it was psychological warfare. He would bring the war to the civilian doorstep. On November 15, 1864, Sherman's army of 60,000 men marched out of Atlanta, which they had already set aflame. The night before, fires consumed buildings and lit the sky in eerie crimson. Civilians watched in horror as their city, the pride of the South, burned to embers. The war had come home. Sherman divided his forces into two wings, fanning out through rural Georgia. His men cut telegraph wires, tore up railroad tracks, twisting the rails into Sherman's neckties, and dismantled bridges. Granaries, cotton gins, and warehouses were burned. Entire towns were stripped of food and livestock. As the army moved forward, a trail of smoke followed. Union soldiers called it the Grand March, but for Southerners, it was a nightmare. The campaign shattered illusions. No longer could civilians view the war as distant. Sherman marched through plantations and homesteads alike, cutting through the Confederacy's myth of invincibility. Resistance was minimal. Confederate General John Bell Hood, whose army had been shattered in defense of Atlanta, attempted to lure Sherman north by invading Tennessee, but Sherman ignored him. His eyes were fixed eastward. He wasn't chasing armies. He was chasing collapse. Slaves flocked to Sherman's columns in droves. Families walked barefoot for miles, seeking protection, food, or simply a glimpse of freedom. Sherman was ambivalent. While he believed slavery was morally wrong, he worried that masses of freed people would slow his advance. Still, his march left behind liberated towns and shattered chains. Union soldiers, though victorious, were not saints. While discipline was mostly maintained, instances of looting, vandalism, and even cruelty occurred. Southern civilians, stripped of their livelihoods, remembered the march with bitterness that would last generations. It was a campaign of deliberate devastation. But the destruction was strategic. By targeting infrastructure, not mass killing, Sherman aimed to break the Confederacy's spine, not its soul. Railroads became ash. Fields were trampled. Southern morale collapsed. For many, it was the moment they realized the war could not be won. Sherman's army lived off the land, foraging from barns, smokehouses, and fields. Soldiers called themselves bummers, raiders who confiscated supplies, often with little subtlety. Yet their movement was swift and effective. In just a few weeks, they covered 300 miles through enemy territory. By December 10th, Sherman reached the outskirts of Savannah, one of the Confederacy's last remaining ports. Confederate forces, too weak to defend it, withdrew. On December 21st, the city surrendered without a fight. Sherman wired Lincoln, "I beg to present you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah." The message was more than a gesture. It was proof that the Confederacy could be penetrated at its core, that no city, no state, no symbol of resistance was safe. Sherman had torn out Georgia's heart and offered it to the Union. For Abraham Lincoln, reeling from years of bloodshed and political pressure, Sherman's success was validation. The war was turning. Northern newspapers, once filled with doubt, now printed headlines of triumph. The public, weary of grief, saw hope flicker once more. For the Confederacy, however, the march was an omen of doom. News of Sherman's approach created panic. Refugees flooded into cities. Rail lines ceased functioning. Georgia's economy collapsed. Morale fell to its lowest ebb since the war began. Sherman had proven that the Confederacy was vulnerable not just on the battlefield, but at its roots, economically, socially, and spiritually. The old Southern world, built on cotton and slavery, was crumbling beneath his boots. His tactics would forever be debated. Was Sherman a liberator or a destroyer? A genius or a brute? In truth, he was all of these, a man who saw the war not just as a clash of armies, but of civilizations. His march left scars that never fully healed. Yet, for all its fire and fury, Sherman's campaign hastened the end. The Confederacy was unraveling. Its fields lay in ruin. Its people faced starvation. Its armies, scattered and demoralized, could not stop what was coming next. The march to the sea was not just a military maneuver, it was a statement that the age of slavery, secession, and Southern dominance was ending. And from the scorched earth would rise a new union, one forged by fire and bound by freedom. By mid-1864, the American Civil War had become a merciless war of attrition. In the East, General Ulysses S. Grant, now commander of all Union armies, turned his full might against General Robert E. Lee. No longer content to chase battles, Grant's strategy was simple: engage, pin, and wear the Confederacy down. It was not elegant. It was effective. After brutal confrontations in the Overland Campaign, at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor, Grant moved southward toward Petersburg, Virginia, a vital rail and supply hub just 25 miles south of Richmond. Petersburg was the Confederate lifeline. Capturing it would choke the Confederate capital and seal Lee's fate. Lee, understanding its importance, raced his army of Northern Virginia to defend Petersburg. But his numbers were dwindling. Ill-fed, undersupplied, and constantly under threat, Lee's forces were shadows of their former selves. Yet he dug in and fortified. So began one of the most grueling episodes of the war, the Siege of Petersburg. It wasn't a traditional siege. Instead of walls and battering rams, it was a slow-motion death match of trenches, sharpshooters, and exhaustion. Both armies dug into the earth like moles, creating miles of interlocking trenches, resembling the early forms of modern trench warfare that would later define World War I. Union artillery bombarded Confederate lines day and night. Confederate guns answered in kind. The earth itself became the battlefield, scarred, cratered, and soaked in blood. Soldiers lived in mud, suffered disease, and slept beside rats and the dead. Rain turned trenches into swamps. Heat bred flies and dysentery. Amid this morass, the Battle of the Crater occurred in July 1864, an audacious and tragic episode. Union troops, many of them black soldiers, tunneled beneath Confederate lines and packed it with explosives. When the mine detonated, it created a massive crater and a breach. But confusion followed. Instead of flanking the breach, Union troops charged directly into the crater and became trapped. Confederate soldiers fired down from the edges, turning the pit into a slaughterhouse. Over 3,500 Union casualties were counted, many from the U.S. colored troops who had bravely led the attack and were shown no mercy. The failure cast a pall over Union efforts. But Grant did not retreat. He kept extending his lines, grinding Lee's forces thinner and thinner. Meanwhile, Sherman's success in the South meant fewer reinforcements were coming to Lee's aid. Every passing week tilted the balance further. Inside Petersburg and Richmond, life became desperate. Food was scarce. Civilians bartered for rat meat and pine cones. Confederate soldiers, many without shoes, stood guard in freezing weather. Desertions increased. Hope was fading, but still they held. Grant, relentless and unsentimental, knew time was on his side. "I propose to fight it out on this line if it takes all summer," he had said earlier. Now it had taken far longer, but he was close. By early 1865, Union lines stretched more than 30 miles. The Confederate defenses were paper-thin. In February and March, Grant launched a final series of offensives. Slowly, surely, the Union Army gained ground. Confederate positions were overrun. Rail lines were severed. Lee begged for reinforcements that would never arrive. The vise was closing. Finally, on April 1, 1865, the Union scored a decisive victory at the Battle of Five Forks, southwest of Petersburg. It was the breaking point. The next day, Grant launched a general assault. The Confederate lines collapsed. Petersburg was doomed. On April 2nd, Lee informed President Jefferson Davis that Richmond must be evacuated. Panic spread through the city. That night, Confederate troops set fire to supply depots and warehouses to prevent them from falling into Union hands. Flames engulfed the capital. On April 3rd, Union troops marched into Richmond and Petersburg. Black Union soldiers were among the first to enter the Confederate capital. An image so potent that it symbolized the entire arc of the war, from bondage to liberation. As Lee's army retreated west, it became a ghost army, exhausted, hungry, and pursued relentlessly. Grant offered terms, urging surrender to avoid unnecessary bloodshed. Lee hesitated, seeking one last miracle. But it was too late. The siege of Petersburg had lasted over 9 months, with nearly 70,000 total casualties. It was not a battle won in a day, but in the will to endure. And it brought the Confederacy to the edge of collapse. Petersburg broke not just the lines, but the myth of Confederate invincibility. Lee, once a figure of dignity and dominance, was now a commander with no cards left to play. The final chapter had begun. And as the Union flag rose over Petersburg's shattered landscape, America stood on the threshold, not only of victory, but of reckoning. The siege of Petersburg shattered the Confederacy's final defensive shell. In its wake, General Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia began their last march westward, wounded, starved, and surrounded. Their destination was uncertain, but their fate was nearly sealed. Lee had hoped to reach the railroad junction at Lynchburg, where he could resupply and possibly link with Confederate forces in North Carolina. But Ulysses S. Grant was not about to let his prize escape. His Union forces shadowed Lee's every move, cutting off roads, ambushing supply lines, and relentlessly closing in. For Lee's army, the retreat was an agonizing ordeal. Men marched in tattered uniforms, feet wrapped in rags, subsisting on crumbled cornmeal and dew. Horses dropped in the mud. Rifles were carried by children. The once proud Army of Northern Virginia had become a ghost. As Union cavalry under Philip Sheridan pushed ahead, they seized crucial crossroads and blocked Lee's escape. On April 6th, at Sailor's Creek, a massive segment of Lee's force was captured or killed. Witnessing the scene, Lee reportedly exclaimed, "My God! Has the army dissolved?" Morale collapsed. Entire units surrendered. Desperate Confederate soldiers slipped into the woods, trying to get home, leaving their officers behind. The Confederate dream of independence, of preservation, of honor, was unraveling in fields soaked with silence and surrender. Lee still hesitated. His instinct was to fight on, to preserve dignity. But he knew that to continue would mean annihilation. He faced the unbearable. Surrender. A word that had never touched his lips, now lingered at the edge of every breath. On April 7th, Grant sent Lee a note, gently suggesting the time had come to end the bloodshed. Lee, dignified even in defeat, responded respectfully, asking about terms. Correspondence continued over the next 2 days, terse yet gentlemanly. Two giants of war, speaking through the last flickers of cannon smoke. Finally, on April 9, 1865, in the quiet hamlet of Appomattox Courthouse, Lee agreed to meet Grant and discuss terms. The meeting took place in the home of Wilmer McLean, whose previous house had been damaged at the war's first major battle at Bull Run. Fate had come full circle. Lee arrived first, immaculately dressed in a gray uniform, polished sword at his side. Grant entered later, wearing a simple, mud-splattered coat. The contrast was striking, an image of the old world meeting the new. But there was no arrogance, only solemnity. The room was quiet, no fanfare, no ultimatums. Grant, understanding the moment's weight, offered generous terms. Confederate soldiers would be paroled, allowed to return home with their horses and personal sidearms. Officers could keep their swords. There would be no executions, no trials, only peace. Lee read the document slowly, his face unreadable. Then he nodded. It was over. After 4 years, more than 600,000 deaths, and incalculable heartbreak, the Civil War's bloodiest chapter had reached its end not with thunder, but with a pen. Outside, as word spread through the Union camps, a cheer began to erupt, but Grant immediately stopped it. "The war is over," he said. "The rebels are our countrymen again." It was not a time for triumph. It was a time for healing. Lee mounted his horse, Traveler, and rode back to his men. "Men," he said quietly, "we have fought through the war together. I have done the best I could for you." Then he paused, visibly overcome, and rode away. There were no medals, only tears. The Confederate soldiers, now paroled, began their long journeys home. Many would walk for hundreds of miles. Others would find their homes burned, families lost, or futures uncertain. But they were going home not as victors but as survivors. For the Union, Appomattox was not just a military victory, it was a moral one. It affirmed that democracy would endure, that secession would not stand, that slavery, the nation's original sin, had finally met its judgment. But it was not a clean victory. The wounds were too deep. Cities lay in ruins. Families were shattered. The country was united in law, but fractured in soul. The war had ended, but the struggle for true equality, justice, and healing was only beginning. Grant and Lee would meet again, but never as enemies. Their meeting at Appomattox became a symbol of what was possible, of reconciliation without humiliation, of mercy in the face of bitterness, of honor without bloodshed. In that small Virginia parlor, the war ended not with glory or vengeance, but with restraint and grace. A hush fell across the land, broken only by birdsong and the distant tolling of chapel bells. The guns had fallen silent. The future, uncertain and fragile, now waited. And so, Appomattox did not mark just the end of a war. It marked the beginning of America's second birth. One soaked in sorrow, yes, but also planted with the seeds of transformation. As the sun set on the fields of Appomattox, a wave of quiet swept across the Union. The cannons that had roared for 4 years fell silent. Flags that had drooped in sorrow now fluttered in triumph. And at the center of it all stood Abraham Lincoln, the president who had borne the weight of a fractured nation. For Lincoln, the final weeks of the war were filled with both cautious relief and deep sorrow. The victory came at a devastating cost. Hundreds of thousands dead, families torn apart, cities scorched. He did not cheer the fall of Richmond, nor gloat at Lee's surrender. He saw the path forward not in vengeance, but in reconstruction, compassion, and renewal. When Union troops entered Richmond on April 3, 1865, Lincoln followed just days later, walking through the ruins of the Confederate capital. He arrived without military fanfare, simply, quietly. Freed slaves ran toward him, falling to their knees. Lincoln, visibly moved, told them gently, "Don't kneel to me. You must kneel only to God." He walked the streets with the weight of history on his shoulders. In those moments, Lincoln became more than a president. He became the symbol of liberation. Richmond had once declared its defiance to the Union from its Capitol dome. Now it was Lincoln, tall and sorrowful, who walked through its ashes. Back in Washington, the city bloomed with jubilation. On April 9th, as news of Lee's surrender arrived, bells rang out, people wept openly, and impromptu parades flooded the avenues. But Lincoln remained measured. He knew the hardest battles were yet to come, not of muskets, but of ideas. He had already begun drafting plans for Reconstruction. Lincoln envisioned a nation with malice toward none, with charity for all, where former Confederate states would be welcomed back, not punished, and where Black Americans could take their first steps toward true citizenship. Yet even within his own government, Lincoln's vision faced resistance. Radical Republicans wanted harsh penalties for the South. Others wanted to reinstate slavery in all but name. Lincoln walked a tightrope, trying to preserve the Union, heal old wounds, and birth a new America. On April 11th, just 2 days after Appomattox, Lincoln gave a public speech from a White House balcony. In it, he proposed limited black suffrage in the South, allowing educated black men and former soldiers to vote. Among the crowd stood John Wilkes Booth, a Southern sympathizer and actor. Upon hearing the proposal, he turned to a companion and vowed, "That is the last speech he will ever give." Booth had long viewed Lincoln as a tyrant who had destroyed the Southern way of life. But now, with the Confederacy defeated and Lincoln promising rights to former slaves, Booth's hatred reached its peak. He plotted not just to kill the president, but to shatter the fragile hope of national healing. On the evening of April 14, 1865, just 5 days after Lee's surrender, Lincoln attended a play, Our American Cousin, at Ford's Theater. He arrived with his wife, Mary, and 2 guests. The mood was light, the war seemingly over, and Lincoln, for once, appeared relaxed. At around 10:15 p.m., Booth slipped into the presidential box and fired a single shot into the back of Lincoln's head. Chaos erupted. Booth leapt to the stage, breaking his leg, and cried out, "Sic semper tyrannis," thus always to tyrants. Then he vanished into the night. Lincoln was carried across the street to a boarding house, where he lay unconscious through the night. Doctors could do little. Cabinet members and loved ones gathered, silent and weeping. The man who had saved the Union was slipping away. At 7:22 a.m. on April 15th, Abraham Lincoln took his final breath. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton broke the silence. Now he belongs to the ages. The room stood still. The weight of the moment, of 4 years of war, of emancipation, of sorrow and triumph, settled like fog. The news of Lincoln's death stunned the nation. Bells tolled in mourning. Shops closed. Soldiers sobbed openly in the streets. The man who had steered the country through its darkest storm was gone. Not on the battlefield, but by an assassin's hand. Booth was hunted down and killed 12 days later, but the wound he inflicted would linger far longer. Lincoln's death not only robbed the nation of its leader but of its moral compass at a most fragile juncture. As Lincoln's body was transported by train through cities and towns across the North, millions gathered to pay their respects. Women wept, soldiers saluted, children sang hymns. His funeral train became a pilgrimage of grief and gratitude. He was laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois, beside his beloved son Willie. He left behind not just a preserved Union, but a legacy built on humility, justice, and a dream deferred, not destroyed. Lincoln's assassination was more than a tragedy. It was a national crucifixion. Yet from that sorrow his ideals endured. Though others would falter in carrying forward his vision, his words, his courage, and his humanity became immortal. Even today we turn to him, to the man who asked not for revenge but for reconciliation, who freed a people and held a nation together with trembling hands. His final days were both his finest and his most tragic. The guns had fallen silent, but the true test of the American spirit was only beginning. The Union had been preserved, at the cost of over 620,000 lives, but peace was not yet unity. Victory had ended slavery, but not racism. Secession had failed, but division lingered. The war was over, but the struggle for the soul of the nation had just begun. In the spring of 1865, as Abraham Lincoln's body was laid to rest, a heavy question loomed. How would the North reunite with the South? Reconstruction, both a political plan and a moral endeavor, now stood at the center of America's future. And with Lincoln gone, it would be led by a new, uncertain hand. Vice President Andrew Johnson, a Southern Democrat who had remained loyal to the Union, now assumed the presidency. Though he had despised the Confederacy, he was no friend to equality. His vision of Reconstruction clashed starkly with that of Lincoln's. He favored leniency for ex-Confederates and had little interest in securing rights for newly freed Black Americans. As the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery, Southern states found other ways to restore their dominance. They passed black codes, laws that restricted freedmen's movement, employment, voting rights, and access to justice. In many ways, the chains of slavery were replaced with the cage of systemic control. Congress, outraged by Johnson's passivity and the South's defiance, fought back. Led by radical Republicans, Congress passed the 14th Amendment, guaranteeing citizenship and equal protection under the law to all born in the U.S., including former slaves. The battle over the nation's future escalated. Reconstruction became a war of ideologies. Federal troops were stationed in the South to enforce new laws and protect Black citizens. The South, humiliated and defiant, bristled under military occupation. Old Confederate leaders returned to politics. Bitter memories turned to resentment. Despite the hostility, hope flickered. Freedmen's schools were established across the South. Black churches flourished. The Freedmen's Bureau was created to assist former slaves in finding food, housing, and employment. And for the first time in American history, Black men were elected to Congress, including Hiram Revels and Blanche K. Bruce from Mississippi. But progress was fragile. White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, wielding terror as their weapon. Lynchings, arson, and assassinations became tools of political control. The promise of freedom was shadowed by the reality of violence. In the North, fatigue set in. After a decade of war and Reconstruction, many Americans yearned to move on. Economic depression in 1873 shifted priorities. Political will to enforce civil rights waned. Compromise, not justice, became the currency of governance. The final blow came in 1877, with the Compromise of 1877. In exchange for resolving the disputed presidential election, federal troops were withdrawn from the South. Reconstruction officially ended, and with it, the fragile protections for black citizens vanished. Jim Crow laws would soon rise in their place. For the South, Reconstruction was remembered with bitterness, an era of defeat, occupation, and forced change. For Black Americans, it was a moment of emancipation followed by abandonment. For the North, it was a lost cause never fully pursued. Yet, the war and its aftermath had changed America irrevocably. Slavery, once written into the nation's constitution, was now abolished. The idea of citizenship was redefined. The Union, once fragmented, had been stitched back together, but the scars remained. The Civil War's legacy became a mirror, reflecting both the nation's highest ideals and its deepest flaws. It raised enduring questions. What does it mean to be free? Who gets to belong? Can a nation built on contradiction become one of equality? In the decades that followed, veterans aged, monuments rose, and memory became a battleground. Some clung to the myth of the lost cause, romanticizing the Confederacy. Others clung to the ideals Lincoln died for: freedom, equality, and unity. It would take another century before the civil rights movement of the 1960s revived the struggle for justice. Leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. would walk in the footsteps of Lincoln and Frederick Douglass, echoing their calls for a more perfect union. Today, the Civil War remains etched in the American psyche. Its battlefields are quiet now, but its echoes continue in debates over race, heritage, identity, and democracy. Its story is not just about the past. It is a living lesson about who we are and who we aspire to become. The war's end was not an ending, but a beginning, a doorway into a new, uncertain America, more inclusive, more flawed, more dynamic. The ashes of Gettysburg, Vicksburg, and Appomattox became the soil from which new freedoms would eventually grow. And as the stars and stripes flutter over a nation once divided, we remember not only the battles fought, but the dream dared, that out of many, we are one. That a house once divided might, through hardship and hope, stand together again.